what to say. Yeah, Harris deserves a lot of credit, but Harris's work wasn't read. My name is John Goldsmith, and I'm writing a book along with a friend and colleague, Bernard Lax. This book is about a dyad, a pair of people, a mentor and a student. The mentor is Zellig Harris. The student is Noam Chomsky. And the book we're writing is about the relationship that includes the two of them in the beginning of Noam Chomsky's career and in the middle of Zellig Harris's career. We're studying a period that goes roughly from the end of World War II, from around 1946 up until 1960 or so. The book covers a lot of territory, and in this video, I'm only going to talk about one of the last chapters. It's a very important chapter in the story just before Noam Chomsky's work becomes well known. In this video, I'm going to focus on one particular analysis that both Harris and Chomsky talked about, and that's the analysis of the English verbal auxiliary. The relationship between the analyses that the two of them present is pretty strange. It's really strange. It's not at all what I expected, and you're going to be surprised. But before I get there, I need to explain a few things. And I need to tell you a little bit about Zellig Harris and a little bit about Noam Chomsky. Zellig Harris was born in 1909. He was born in Ukraine, and he came to the United States about 4 years later. He grew up primarily in Philadelphia. He spent a few years in his youth in Palestine, but he spent almost his entire life in Philadelphia. He was an undergrad at the University of Pennsylvania and then went on in graduate school, got a master's and then a PhD studying the Semitic languages, the history of the Semitic languages. Then he became a full professor towards the end of the 1930s. Just after World War II, a Department of Linguistics was founded at the University of Pennsylvania, and Harris was the center of that department for decades and stayed there until he retired. Zellig Harris got to know Noam Chomsky at the end of Chomsky's first year as an undergraduate. Chomsky himself was born in 1928 in Philadelphia. His parents were immigrants from Eastern Europe, and they were both involved in the teaching of Hebrew. Noam Chomsky was an undergrad at the University of Pennsylvania, was not really thrilled by the courses that he was taking as a freshman. Chomsky's father, William, was concerned with the possibility that Chomsky might even drop out of college because the young Noam seemed inclined to do just that. Well, William Chomsky, Noam's father, knew Zellig Harris. They were both professors and they were both students of Hebrew and the Semitic languages. William Chomsky called Zellig Harris and asked if possibly he could get in touch with his son, if Zellig Harris could get in touch with his son, see what he could do to interest him in his studies. Harris agreed to do so, invited Chomsky to see him, and that began a relationship between them. We talk a lot about this in this book. I'm not going to go into those details here. One thing led to another. Chomsky studied linguistics as an undergrad. He went on and wrote a master's thesis. He spent 2 years past his bachelor's at the University of Pennsylvania, defended a master's thesis in 1951. In 1951, he was awarded a Harvard Junior Fellowship with the help of Zellig Harris and Nelson Goodman, a professor of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. Chomsky in 1951 went up to Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Harvard University is. He spent 4 years as a Harvard Junior Fellow. In 1955, he got a job as an assistant professor at MIT. In 1957, he published a book called Syntactic Structures, just barely 100 pages of real content in it that left an indelible impression on American and indeed international linguistics. As we'll see in a few minutes, many people who read the book were extremely impressed, well, with many things, but more than anything else, with Chomsky's analysis of the English verbal auxiliary, and everybody came away talking about affix hopping. Wow, that was an amazing analysis. And many people, including myself, just felt that the doors to linguistics were opened up and beckoned to them when they read Syntactic Structures and the analysis of the English auxiliary. Well, at a certain point in reading this book, it became clear to me I needed to read an important paper by Zellig Harris. This was a paper that Harris had presented in 1955 as the presidential address to the Linguistic Society of America. Harris was president of the LSA that year, and it is the custom that the president gives an annual address, and about a year later the paper is published in the journal Language, which is the official organ of the Linguistic Society of America. Harris's paper, in a much expanded form, was published in 1957. So Harris and Chomsky both published very important works in 1957. Harris's was an expansion of a paper that he had written in 1955, and Chomsky wrote a short book that was published in 1957, so it was finished sometime earlier. So these two works, one by Harris, one by Chomsky, were written around the same time, and we're going to compare them. That's the purpose of our discussion today. And the time they were written is roughly the same time. Well, the thing is, there's a lot of similarities. And one route that we can't go down the route of saying, this could be one more case like Newton and Leibniz of two geniuses working from miles apart, coming up with the same ideas using slightly different notations. Don't even think of going there. We're talking about a dissertation advisor and a student, a mentor and a student, which is about the closest intellectual relationship that there can possibly be. And I would add that Harris was an extremely charismatic individual, and Chomsky never denied the degree of charismatic attraction that he too felt with respect to Harris. There's no point in going down this road of, well, they came up with this thing independently. All right, I need to tell you a little bit about the English auxiliaries. Let me begin by showing you some facts about the English auxiliary. If you're a linguist, you've seen a lot of this before, but I'll put it together, even though you may have seen it in some other ways. First of all, let's take a look at a table that shows the English auxiliary. And the easiest way to see what's going on is if we create a table with a bunch of rows that show different possibilities and columns. The first column will contain a subject of a sentence. The second will contain a modal verb like may or might, should, can, will. And I'll use may in my examples here. The next column will have the perfect verb have, some form of the verb have. The next column will have the be of the progressive. So the progressive is what we have when we say John is sleeping as opposed to John sleeps, which is not the progressive. And in terms of the perfect, we call the sentence like John has slept, we say is a perfect aspect, whereas John slept is just a past tense. So we've got the columns subject, modal, perfect, progressive, and then the main verb. And in this table, I'll put down C. So we've got lots of possibilities. We've got sentences like you see and John sees. I put both down there so you see that there's a suffix S when the subject is a third person singular and the verb is in the present. Don't forget, we've got an S suffix in the third person singular present. In other present cases, we've got no apparent suffix. We say you see, I see, we see, they see. There's no S suffix. There's no apparent suffix at all. In the past tense, we say John saw, and linguists typically say that saw is like a combination of see plus a past tense suffix, which would otherwise be realized as ed. So saw, in a certain sense, is very much like seed. John seed, we say John saw. We can say John may see, John may have seen, John has seen, John had seen, John is seeing, John may be seeing, and John may have been seeing. So we've got all these possibilities here. And they fit together in that simple table. So where do the suffixes show up? What are the principles lying behind when the en and the ed and the s? Where do they appear? So where does the en suffix appear? Well, if we look at this next table here, you see John has seen, John had seen. We've got the en suffix, and it appears after has and had. John may have seen, similarly. John has been seeing, so we've got the en on the be that follows has, and John may have been seeing. So in all these cases, the en shows up on the verb right after the perfect have. So that's simple enough. So that's where the en suffix appears. What about the ing suffix? Well, we say John is walking, John may be walking, John may have been walking. The ing appears on the verb right after be. So it's similar, logically similar to question, where does the en show up? And where does the tense appear? The tense suffix, which could be the s in the third person singular present. You say John sees, so it shows up on the verb there. You say John is seeing. Well, the is like be plus the s suffix. John be's singing. John is seeing is like John be plus s seeing. John has, which is like have plus s. John has seen. John may have seen. Well, hold off on that John may have seen case for a moment. But what we see in all the other cases is that the first verb, but I include have and be as verbs when I say the first verb is that element on which the tense falls, whether it's s or ed, any tense suffix. Now, in the case of John may have seen, we don't see an s suffix at all. But it's customary, you don't have to buy this now, but it is customary, and we'll continue to say that the s suffix shows up on the may. So the first verb, which includes a modal or a be or a have, or main verb, is where the tense suffix falls. All right, now we turn to the question of do, the special verb do. And we're going to be talking about what's come to be known as the dummy do. So there's a main verb do, like I did the dishes, and then there's the dummy do, which is what we're talking about here. And the dummy do is a do that shows up, for example, with the word not. So I don't do the dishes, or he didn't do the dishes. The second do is the main verb do, but the first is the dummy do. So let's see, when does the dummy do appear? And here we've got some examples. You do see. If you stress it, you can say you do see, or John does see. If we do that, we don't have a tense on the main verb, so you don't say John does sees. The tense shows up on the first verb, and here it's does in this case. But the does has to be stressed. So we can't say John does see. It's only John does see. We can't say John does may have seen. We can't say John does have seen. John does be seeing, or John does is seeing. No other combination. John does may see. John do may have been walking or seeing. None of those are possible. All right, where else can do show up? Well, do shows up a lot when we invert and form a question, like a so-called yes-no question, or in fact, other questions equally. So you say, do you see, or does John see? So you use do when you invert, and you've got a main verb but no auxiliary verb. So if there is an auxiliary, like a modal verb, you say, may John see. You don't say, does John may see. You don't say that. You say, may John have seen, has John seen, is John seeing, may John be seeing, and may John have been seeing. So we use do when we invert, when we don't have any auxiliary verbs. We can't invert the main verb. We have to invert something. And we use do when there's not, sometimes the word not. We don't say, you not walk. We say, you do not walk. We don't say John not walks. We say John does not walk. When we've got another auxiliary verb, we don't use do. We can say John may not walk, or John may not have walked, or if we don't have a modal verb, we have has, we could say John has not walked, or John is not walking, or John may not be walking, or John may not have been walking. We need the do if we don't have an auxiliary verb. So those are basic facts. Now I want to talk to you about Harris's analysis. So Harris had this analysis I've explained to you in his presidential address published in 1957. I must admit I've never seen any references to it And although I thought I had read the paper once upon a time, I decided 2-3 years ago, I was writing a book about the relationship between Harris and Chomsky, the pair of them and their relationship. I better read it carefully. And as I read it, I found an analysis of the auxiliary. Now, I have to say this. Reading Harris is really, really hard. And if I hadn't spent years reading and rereading his most famous book, which was published in 1951 and called Methods in Structural Linguistics, if I hadn't spent years reading and rereading it and trying to figure out what he was saying, I couldn't have read the 1955 or 57 paper on transformational grammar. I could read the sentences and not understand what they meant. But as it is, I speak his language, the language that he was writing in then. So I was able to figure out what he was saying. And I'm going to tell you what he said, and I'm going to show you how he wrote it. So I'm going to interrupt myself. I'm going to edit this and show you the text, but I'm going to try to explain it to you first. First, Harris says, every auxiliary verb, which is be and have, has an affix, en or ing. And the following verb, the verb that follows it, slips leftward in between the auxiliary and its suffix. If we're going to look at a sentence like he is jumping, on Harris's analysis, its basic structure is he, and then is, and then a bracket with nothing in it, followed by ing. So that this progressive thing has three parts to it. There's an is, and then there's a kind of a bracketed null position, followed by ing, and then the main verb follows. And then what happens is the main verb moves leftward and slips inside that bracketed position. So that's Harris's analysis of the auxiliary verbs have, be, and have. Each of those has a verb, be or have, and a suffix. And when it's followed by another verb, that verb slips leftward into a position before the suffix. So, as I say, he is ing plus swim. The swim moves leftward between the is and the ing, and we get he is swimming. Okay. So those of you who are 10 steps ahead of me will recognize that this is what has come to be known as affix hopping. The thing here is that it's not the affix that's hopping, it's the verb that's moving leftward into a position waiting for it in between the auxiliary verb and the affix. But it's much the same idea. So hold that. That's the first part of Zellig Harris's analysis, affix hopping. The second point is this. This was a major point for Harris, that there are 3 tense morphemes, verbal suffixes in English. One is the ed past tense, one is the third person singular s, and the third is a null morpheme, null, phonologically null, but which appears in the first and second person singular, that's I swim and you swim, and all the plural cases, we swim, you swim, plural, they swim. So those verbs don't have no suffix. They have a suffix, but it's phonologically null. So Harris was proposing, to my knowledge, is the first clear argument for the presence of a phonologically null syntactic morpheme, and that morpheme plays an absolutely crucial role in what's about to follow. So that's his second point. The third point is that the auxiliary do, what we have come to call the dummy do, is inserted when it's needed to bear a tense morpheme. And crucially, this involves the null or silent tense morpheme. That's what provides the argument that that morpheme exists. It has to exist because syntactically it needs to attach to something. And when it can't attach to the main verb, either because of inversion or because of the presence of not, then you have to insert a dummy do. Again, if you're 10 steps ahead of me, you're saying, wow, this can't be Harris. This is Chomsky. Well, I'm sorry, this is Harris. we'll look at the text in just a moment. And then there's a fourth point here where Harris is not clear. And you read it, I'll show you. You can see he's being pulled in two directions. And that's on the question of what's the basic position for the tense suffix. What is its basic position? Or today we would probably say its underlying position. Harris starts off saying that its basic position is after the main verb. And then something pulls it leftward. But by the end of his analysis, you can see that he's come to the conclusion that, in fact, it starts at the beginning of the auxiliary. And we'll look at that now in some more detail. So you should be shocked at this point if you know where all this is going. The main points of Chomsky's analysis of syntactic structures, they're all here in Harris's analysis. You're thinking, how is this possible? Whose analysis is this? Who borrowed from who took from who? Yeah, all those questions. We have to ask them. We have to answer them. And the answers are not going to be satisfying. Now, I think it's really important that I showed you exactly how we find Zellig Harris's analysis in the paper. And so I want to show you the paper and go through it sentence by sentence. But the truth is, that's going to require some real digging, and I'm not sure that all of you want to go into it. So I'm going to save that to the end. Okay, so I'm going to pass now from what I've said about Harris's analysis. We're going to turn to what Chomsky says, and then I want to draw some comparisons and some conclusions. Once I've done that, I'm going to go back to Harris's paper for those of you who want to see what he really said, so that I can show you how his analysis is present in what he wrote, even though it's really hard to dig it out. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to turn to what Chomsky said. Let's turn to Chomsky's analysis now. Chomsky has two kinds of rules. He's got phrase structure rules and transformations. Harris never talked about phrase structure rules. He's got expansions, and that's what a lot of methods in structural linguistics is about, but he doesn't call them phrase structure rules. Phrase structure rules is definitely Chomsky's term and Chomsky's invention. And Chomsky's notation here clearly lays out exactly what Harris said. And so here are the four rules that Chomsky gives. First, verb goes to aux plus v. Second, v then expands as you choose a lexical verb from the lexicon. Third, aux expands as c. We don't know what c stands for, but Rule 4 explains that it can be one of the tense morphemes for the verbal system. C plus an optional modal verb, followed by have plus en, followed by be plus ing, followed by be plus en. The third rule is what Harris said, but using Chomsky's notation now. Now we get to affix hopping. We've already seen Harris's analysis. Harris's analysis moves the verb leftward into a position which isn't assigned a particular category, but if it were, it would be an empty verbal position. Chomsky writes this: let little v stand for any m or v, modal verb or verb, or have or be, that is, for any non-affix in the phrase verb. M, v, have, and be are not of the same category in Chomsky's analysis. But he says, let's let little v stand for any of those. And then he says we've got a rule, af plus v, they invert, becomes v plus af. So this is called affix hopping. As you see, the way the rule is written, it's not the case that the affix hops, nor is it the case that the verb moves. Rather, the order of the two is reversed. There's a permutation, but we can't say in what order they appear. Okay, and then Chomsky gives this gorgeous derivation of this sentence, and this is what blew people's minds. So this is a derivation of the sentence, the man has been reading the book. So it starts with the man plus the man verb the book, which is not the first line of the derivation. Several things have happened. We started off with a sentence, various things have happened. We now have the man verb the book with plus boundaries in between each of those elements. Then Verb expands to aux plus big V with a plus in between. Aux expands to C plus have plus en plus be plus ing. The rest stays the same. So those are options. Those are options in the phrase structure rule, and he's chosen these options. Then C expands as the third person singular suffix, S. So that gives us the man, S, have, en, be, ing, read the book. And now the have and the S invert. They permute with one another. The n plus be invert. The ing plus read invert. And certain pluses connected to those permutations turn into word boundaries. And then all the other pluses turn into word boundaries. And he explains exactly which change when, but I haven't explained that to you yet. And then finally we have, then the man has been reading the book. And everything is fine except have plus S has to turn into has, and be plus en has to turn into been. Okay, that's Chomsky's analysis. So here's that rule of a dummy do support do insertion. Chomsky writes this. Let us now add to the grammar the following obligatory transformational rule, which applies after one affix hop rule. And this is rule 2. It says word boundary af goes to word boundary do plus af, where do is the same element as the main verb in John does his homework, what I call the main verb do. What 2 states is that do is introduced as the bearer of an unaffixed affix. Well, actually, no, it doesn't say that. It really doesn't say that at all. It's Harris who said that you insert the do when you need it because there's an affix which needs to attach to something. That's not a notion that's available in generative grammar for decades, this notion of do something. If when you don't do it, it leads to a situation which leads to ungrammaticality. That's not something available in generative grammar for a long, long time. What generative grammar has are options like you see here. You've got a rule. You specify what the condition is. If a word boundary is followed by affix, then insert a do there. And we can imagine what that means is the affix wants to attach to something on its left, but it can't do that if the word boundary is there. But that's all in our imaginations. It's not in the grammar. With that rule, Chomsky's derivation of John does not paint is this. So we have John S. paint, John S. not paint, which is inserted by transformational rule. Then affix hopping should apply or can apply, but there's nothing for it to apply to. So now plus becomes a word boundary. That's part of the affix hopping rule. And now do is inserted by rule 2 because the S suffix, well, not because anything, because the S suffix is immediately preceded by a word boundary. And so do is inserted and we get John does not paint once do plus S turn into does. So Chomsky's analysis is this. Each auxiliary verb, be and have, has an affix, en and ing, and the affix and the following verb flip around each other, affix hopping. We saw that in Harris. There's a null suffix in the present tense, except for the third person singular where it's s, but the null suffix is a real and important morpheme. That was Harris's point. The auxiliary do is inserted under certain formal circumstances. We can't say when it's needed to bear a tense morpheme. That's not expressible in the grammar. And the tense morpheme for Chomsky begins at the left of the whole auxiliary and shifts to the right. Furthermore, he writes the rules. That's truly crucial. He discusses rule ordering, and he gives derivations and trees. And that's what makes it amazing. I want to explain to you how powerful the impact was of Chomsky's analysis in syntactic structures. Now, I felt it, but other people have written about this, and I just want to share a few things that people have said. I've got more quotes in the book than I'll share with you here. David Lightfoot, for example, wrote the following. He wrote, "The showcase analysis, however, the part of syntactic structures that excited the author, David Lightfoot, and had the greatest effect on readers, was the new treatment of the English auxiliary verbs, section 5.3. Chomsky proposed a simple auxiliary transformation, later dubbed affix hopping, whereby an affix like ing, en, or an abstract tense marker could be moved to the immediate right of an adjacent verb. This ingenious transformation, mapping one abstract level of representation into another, not sentences into other sentences, avoided hopelessly complex phrase structure rules and yielded an elegant account for the distribution of periphrastic do, which could be characterized now as occurring with stranded affixes, which had no adjacent verb to hop over. I may say this is me saying this, and I'm pretty sure David Lightfoot would agree, that when he wrote not sentences into other sentences, he's saying this transformation does not map sentences to other sentences. What he means is this is not one of Zellig Harris's transformations, which, as we know, only transforms one sentence into another. Well, obviously, the point of our discussion here is that this was Harris's idea of transformation. All right. Second example, Ray Jackanoff. Jackanoff was one of Chomsky's early students. He was in the basically second generation of grad students at MIT in the period from 65 to 70. And years later, he recalled that Chomsky, quote, developed a rigorous and captivating formalism for describing the intricacies of grammar. I say captivating because in the course of my presidential address at the LSA, I asked how many of you became a linguist because you thought Chomsky's account of the English auxiliary and syntactic structures was just so cool, and hands went up all over the room. Well, mine was one of the hands that went up. But yeah, this was captivating. And in a later generation, Marcel den Dicken, who is a Dutch linguist, reviewed a collection of papers about syntactic structures that was published on the 60th anniversary of the book's appearance. And he wrote, the field's love of Chomsky's analysis of the English verbal inflection and the auxiliary system is declared passionately in many places in the volume. Howard Lasnik calls it, quote, single best syntactic analysis of anything ever. Mark Aronoff, whose chapter is devoted specifically to this analysis, invokes the last lines of Keats' Ode to a Grecian Urn. Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know to sing its praise. It's certainly possible to find more examples of people talking about it, but we don't need more. This was the effect that this analysis had on the field when it appeared in Syntactic Structures. So what are we going to say now? What's the relationship between the two, the work of Harris and Chomsky? Well, Harris is no longer with us. We cannot ask. Harris was working with Chomsky at the time, from what Harris suggests in what he wrote then. He thanks Chomsky for his conversations and suggestions, and elsewhere in Harris's paper, the 1957 paper we're talking about, elsewhere he thanks Chomsky for particular suggestions, like, for example, that you can conjoin two elements if and only if they're the same syntactic category. Chomsky's position is complicated. If you go to Syntactic Structures, there is no suggestion in his discussion of this analysis that he's borrowed anybody's analysis. He doesn't even cite C.C. Free's work, which is surely what got this all started, his work on this subject in the very early 1950s. He doesn't cite that. At the end of the preface to Syntactic Structures, Chomsky writes, during the entire period of this research, I've had the benefit of very frequent and lengthy discussions with Zellig Harris. So many of his ideas and suggestions are incorporated in the text below and in the research on which it is based that I will make no attempt to indicate them by special reference. Harris's work on transformational structure, which proceeds from a somewhat different point of view from that taken below, is developed in items 15, 16, and 19 of the bibliography. which includes the paper that we've been talking about, the presidential address. Okay, so got all this stuff together, and I said to myself, well, Chomsky and Harris were working together. Harris was Chomsky's advisor, and I'm pretty sure from what I've heard from Harris's family, Chomsky met with Harris. So surely they were working on this together, two views of work they did together. They didn't cite each other. I don't understand why, but okay. So I sent an email to Chomsky. Not that it matters, but Chomsky was one of my teachers. He was on my dissertation committee back in 1976. I was on good terms with him. So I wrote him and I said, yeah, I imagine that the two of you were working together on this. No? And he wrote back, I never bothered with these things, but since you bring it up, the facts are the opposite. My work on the auxiliary, inspired by some comments of Morris's, that's Morris Sally, who was my advisor, inspired by some comments of Morris's, appears in LSLT and was carried out in 1951-52 when I discussed it with Harris. I frankly didn't think much of his analysis of it in his 55 paper. True, there's a connection with have and en, but they're not a discontinuous morpheme in any useful sense. Furthermore, that's just a description of the facts to be explained. The analysis in terms of a transformational rule was an effort to explain the facts. So this was in February of 2023, so it's almost 3 years ago. All right, I didn't quite know what to think about that when I got it. And the next day, I got another email from Noam. And he wrote, in 1951 or 52, Morris showed me a structural analysis of the English auxiliary system. Footnote here, I think this is C.C. Free's work. Basically a list. And with his usual good intuition, said this can't be right. Took it home. And it was immediately obvious that it could be explained by a simple transformational rule. I wasn't working with Harris, but we met fairly regularly in New York or Princeton, and I'd mentioned work I was doing, though that was not why we met. I mentioned that I was playing with sentence internal operations, which I later called transformations, which were causing lots of confusion, and gave this as an example. Wrote it up in 54 when I was working on LSLT. I paid little attention when Harris gave his description in terms of discontinuous morphemes. Description. It left the mechanism unexplained, consistent with his general approach. I did not know how to react to that, because what I read was Chomsky saying, I stopped meeting with Harris when I left Philadelphia in 51. Except I didn't stop meeting with Harris. We actually continued to meet regularly in New York and Princeton. But we didn't talk about linguistics, even though that's why I went to Cambridge and that's what Harris was doing. And Harris expected me to be working out his model. And Chomsky's also said for the first 2 years until 1953, he was working fully within Harris's perspective and framework. So Chomsky's now saying, or 2 years ago said, they were meeting regularly, but they weren't talking about linguistics. Except that they did talk about linguistics when Chomsky wanted to tell him about his analysis of the auxiliary. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any sense. And then Chomsky says that Harris had an analysis of have plus en, which we've already seen, and that's essentially the affix hopping phenomena. And Chomsky's analysis is essentially no different from Harris's, except that Harris's moves the verb into a position that's been defined in terms of brackets. But otherwise, it's really hard to see that there's any difference, except that Chomsky formulates it as a transformation, which is a big deal, granted, but that's the difference. And then there's two other main points that Harris makes, which is the null morpheme and the do support. And that's what made Chomsky's analysis what it was. Who's to say what counts as description, what counts as explanation? Well, all right, conclusions. Here's what I think. Halley gave Chomsky C.C. Free's account of the auxiliary. Harris read it too. All American linguists read it. Chomsky met with Harris in 52 or 53, and they discussed their analyses. Just as a footnote now, Chomsky says 51 or 52. Chomsky left Philadelphia in 51, moved to Harvard. They were settling in the fall. In the fall, Chomsky rewrote his master's thesis, the Morphophonemics of Modern Hebrew. And the final version that he really liked, he got done at the very end of the year, in December of 51. That's clearly what he was working on that fall. So if he starts working on the auxiliary, maybe it's in 52. Maybe it's in 53. Chomsky thought he could improve on Harris's analysis, and he did. He improved it. He made it clear that the tense begins at the very left of the auxiliary, something that Harris was uncertain about. The rest of the analysis is Harris's. What Chomsky contributes is huge. It's the rules, how to formulate them, and writing derivations, showing them explicitly, and showing how all the pieces fit together and run like clockwork. That's what he thought he was contributing, and he thought that the particular analysis of the auxiliary, in my opinion, he thought that was just some details that illustrated his major point about we write our rules, we order them, and we watch how they apply. He had no idea that this analysis would cause an explosion and everybody would think it was his analysis, despite the fact that in his preface he said, well, don't forget to look at Harris's work. Wow. I don't know what to say. Yeah, Harris deserves a lot of credit, but Harris's work wasn't read. Chomsky obviously contributed stuff too, but, 75%, 80% was Harris's. And that's how we have to acknowledge it. Okay, so this is one of the final chapters of the book, and I hope you read the book. It'll be coming out pretty soon. I'd like to read through the relevant sections of Harris's paper with you now and go through them more or less sentence by sentence because it's really hard to follow. But there's some really important points there, as I've already said. So this is section 2.5, and it's called little v auxiliaries. If we compare he paints, he painted, with he doesn't paint, he does paint, did he paint, only then did he paint, I painted and so did he, we see that in the presence of certain conditions, not, emphatic stress, question intonation, etc., v plus its suffix is replaced by do plus that suffix plus v. The order is changed of the suffix and the v. And that in a subset of these conditions, question or after certain words, do plus that suffix, do plus the suffix, further changes places with the preceding n. So let me paraphrase that now. What he's saying is, look at all these sentences. You can see that there's some cases where there's a tense suffix on the verb, the main verb, paint. But then there are other closely related sentences where that suffix appears on the verb do, which precedes it. Somehow the tense morpheme is moving its position. That's how he's asking us to look at the data. And in some of those cases, the do, which has grabbed the suffix, so to speak, has moved over the subject. It's on the other side of the subject. That's what he's asking us to see. If we consider, he says, that the main verb, V, the main verb, remains paint, it won't be easy to explain the occurrence of do here. What's do doing here? Really, what he's saying is do an auxiliary verb here, or is it really a main verb? If we consider that the main verb in the altered sentences is do, so that means we would have two main verbs in these sentences, with paint as somehow a secondary element, as if there were a main verb do and it had a subordinate verb phrase within it, as in he learned to paint or he started to paint. The grammar will be simpler. Well, okay, think about that. For Harris, the grammar being simpler is a good thing, and all the things being equal, you'll go for an analysis in which the grammar is simpler. But he's being ironic here. He's saying it would be simpler, but there are drawbacks to that, and that's what he wants to go ahead and show us. So let's continue. But it will turn out that the individual sentence environments in these altered sentences will be identical with those where paint is the V, even though in the altered sentences V is now do. That is totally not clear. Let me explain what that means. When he's talking about what else is there, he's talking about things like adverbs. In the example that's going to come up down below, there's this phrase, from the Impressionists. So what he wants to show is that there aren't any adverbs or things like adverbs that can point to do as being a main verb distinct from paint. So lurking behind this is the idea that if you've got a sentence like he learned to paint, where you've got two main verbs, learn, which has a complement to paint, there can be adverbs that are associated with either the upper verb or the lower verb. And that's not the case here. He doesn't say it, but that's what he's thinking. So he says, this is not the case in other sentences where paint is a secondary element. There's a complement. The individual sentence environments around doesn't paint are closely related to the elements around paint, not does. But for, say, learn to paint, we can find environments where paint might not occur, such as he learned to paint from the Impressionists, where from the Impressionists is linked to learn. You learn from, you don't paint from. And he says there's nothing like that with do here. So it's complicated. So this whole first paragraph is about the question, if you say he doesn't paint, is do a main verb which takes paint as a complement or not? And he's saying it's not. He could have approached this another way, like looking at modal verbs and be and have, but that's not how he does it. So he's showing us his lines of thought, and that's, I think, important, because he's showing us how he got to the problem, something we never see with Chomsky. Chomsky takes Harris's solutions, but Harris shows us how he approached the problem, how he got to it. It may not be easy to follow his thinking, but he's doing the best he can, so to speak, to show how he gets to his solutions. Okay, let's read the second paragraph. It's dense. If we now compare he will paint with he will not paint, he will he paint, only then will he paint, I'll paint and so will he, we see that under the same conditions, the V plus auxiliaries, modal auxiliaries, do not change, except that in the subset of conditions mentioned above, the auxiliary changes place with the preceding noun. This and other considerations that will appear suggest that the S and ED tense suffixes be considered affixes of paint, even after they move in front of it, and that the do which precedes them be considered not a morpheme at all, but only a phonemic carrier for the suffixes when they do not have their own main verb, their own V in front of them. The suffixes occur only after phonemic word and interchange in position with V leaves them without a phonemic word. So this is the theory of the dummy do, that there's first a process that moves the tense affix, S and ED. It moves it somehow to the left, and once it's done that S and ED don't seem to have a position to move on to in some cases. They have to move on to something, and therefore there's a dummy do that appears, and that, as we saw in the first set of data. Okay, is that clear? So this is the dummy do theory, which says that S and ED require something to tag onto, so to speak, the old and very traditional notion of enclitics, in a sense of something that affixes need to lean on to something. If that's not familiar, don't worry about it. Okay, so that's the second paragraph. He says, on this basis, we can now analyze the forms which have neither suffix nor auxiliary. Okay, and here we go. I'm going to put these sentences in another table. They paint, they do not paint. They do paint, do they paint? Only then do they paint. We paint and so do they. Okay, so here we've got the dummy do. We say that there's a zero suffix, which is a variant of the S in the third person singular in the present tense, after the main verb, big V, paint, which moves in front of the big V under the conditions indicated. Of course, he doesn't indicate them, but let's get back to that in a second. Like the other suffixes, that's ED and S, this zero is always attached to a preceding phonemic word, and here receives the carrier do. So that's the second main part that I was describing. So the second main point of his analysis is that there's a phonologically null morpheme, which is a present tense morpheme, other than in the third person singular. And he's just announced that, and he's explained what the argument is going to be. The argument is you need to have a tense morpheme which accounts for the insertion of the do, and he motivated that by looking at the third person singular. And he's saying that the other cases are parallel, even though that suffix is null. Next paragraph. There are now two different interchanges of positions, inversions. He said a moment ago that he's described what the conditions are in which this happens, but he hasn't. He's given an example, but he hasn't really said what the conditions are. He writes, as I say, there are now two different interchanges of position, quote-unquote inversions. One is that the suffixes of ed and zero with variant s, those are the three tense suffixes that can appear on the verb in English. The suffixes of big V appear in front of V, to the left of V, under all the conditions of the type illustrated above. You get it. That's the not, the inversion in yes, no questions, and also the and so did I case. So under those conditions, the tense moves over. It moves to the left of its V. So you can see here why I said before, he starts off with an analysis in which tense begins, its underlying position is to the right of the main verb. So he says, just to repeat, they appear in front of the V, all of the conditions of the type illustrated, under all of the conditions illustrated above. They then have the carrier do. The other is that both of these suffixes, and also the auxiliaries will, can, etc., appear in front of the preceding, that is the subject noun, in the subset of conditions exemplified above. Okay, so he's saying there are two inversions or permutations. He doesn't spell out what they are, but he's given you the examples, and so we should be able to figure out just exactly what he has in mind. The first inversion simply brings the suffixes over to the auxiliary position. The suffixes of the verb permute to the left, they move to the left, and now they are on their own, so to speak. When certain elements, including the emphatic, come before the V. So something pulls a tense away from the V. So that's Harris's analysis here. Now there's a footnote. If you read Harris's Methods in Structural Linguistics, the 1951 book, carefully, You get this strong impression that the footnotes are all the thoughts that he had after he had written his first draft. When you read what he writes, it's kind of a conversation between Harris 1 and Harris 2. So that's how we have to read this footnote. But it's an important footnote because it has to do with how to treat the tense suffixes. And in this footnote, he suggests that the tense suffixes have more to do with modal auxiliaries than they have to do with just being something tacked on to the main verb. So let's read what he said. For convenience, that's a phrase that Harris likes to use, and it's never clear what he means by it. For convenience, we'll henceforth consider the ed and 0 and s suffixes to be members of the auxiliary class small v. This requires us to view could, should, etc. as independent members of little v, rather than as can, shall, etc. plus ed. Let me interrupt that. So you could treat could as can plus past tense. And he's saying if we treat tense as being the same as one of these modals, then we can't do that. Alternatively, we can regard the suffixes as a separate class, and then could we could treat as can plus ed. But should, would often occur in environments where ed does not otherwise occur. For example, I would if he will too. Furthermore, we would have to note that can, etc., occur with ed to make could, but not with s. So you can say he can, but he sees. Note in the whole analysis the departure of structural considerations from historical antecedents. Here he's saying that the tense morphemes should probably be put in the same category as the modal verbs. And that raises the question, is he thinking of the basic position of those tense suffix as being the same position as the modal verbs? Whether he is or not, and certainly it would have raised the question in his mind, this footnote would show the question had been raised in his mind. Chomsky's principal improvement on the whole analysis is saying that the basic position of the tense morphemes is at the beginning of the aux. Not in exactly the same category as the modal verbs, but right next to them. And so this is an important footnote in that respect, and trying to pin down exactly what Harris's final thought was on the basic position of the tense morpheme. This next paragraph is a big surprise to me, and it talks about the relationship between big V and little v, main verb, and this auxiliary or tense element in a sentence. So listen to this. The class little v has the following properties. First, each occurs with each big V. 2, V, big V, never occurs without some little v or other, nor little v without some big V. Each V may have some restrictions as to the separable adverb and prepositional phrases. For example, the past tense ed will hardly occurs directly with tomorrow, so it's tense relations. 4, but aside from such restrictions which apply to a given little v equally for all big V, the individual sentence environments of each big V remain the same no matter what the little v. So the big V, the main verb, has a lot of control over what can appear in a sentence in ways that are quite independent of what the little v can do. Little v can only deal with being in charge of things like tense-related adverbs and prepositional phrases. Note that this is not the case, for example, for learn to paint, learn to talk, where the sentence environments differ in various ways from those of painted and talked. The next paragraph, which is the final paragraph of this section, is the most amazing. It's totally amazing. It's where affix hopping comes into the picture, and the way to describe the perfect have and progressive be. Let me just read it with you. The first and third of these three properties also apply to the constructions in he is painting, he has painted, he has been painting. All constructions of this type can be described by saying that between the little v and the big V, there occur sometimes, but not always, have parentheses en, be parentheses ing, or the first of these followed by the second. The empty parentheses mark the location of the following big V word, including have and be. Then he paints, he can paint, has the structure little v, big V. Is painting, maybe painting, has the structure little v plus being plus big V. Has painted, had painted, will have painted are little v plus have, parentheses, en plus big V. Has been painting, could have been painting are little v plus have en plus bing plus big V. These constructions may be viewed as expansions of little v constituting little v phrases of which the little v proper is the head. It's totally amazing. And we could see this better if we drew a diagram of what he has. I'm not going to go into further discussion about Harris's theory of little v and big V. It could be interesting, but you know what? We've been going for an hour already, and only some of you are still watching. This is really an appendix to try to show you how we've been able to extract Harris's analysis from the page or so in that paper, and it's not an easy job, and I hope that by following it with us, you've learned something from that task. But I want to say one more thing. What I've written here has gotten some criticism from friends of mine, people I respect. The suggestion's been made that if you read what I've written, you might get the impression that I think this is right. You certainly get that impression listening to what some people are saying about Chomsky's analysis 60 years on. And, you know, it's not right. It's not close. The particular generalizations that Harris and then later Chomsky developed, they're basically not right. This is not the place to go into it. There's been a lot of work by a lot of people. I'm not going to go into that literature. So it's wrong at a couple of levels. It's wrong descriptively, and it's wrong in terms of figuring out how to cast an explanation. There are so many things that are totally arbitrary about the way Chomsky puts together his rules and the way he formalizes things. And he gives the impression that everything just runs together like well-oiled machinery. And that's really a wonderful impression to make on the readers. But as you go into it and really understand what's going on, you see a tremendous amount of hackery that is anything but elegant. So with the hindsight that we have now, it's not true, and it's no longer even beautiful. But it felt true, and it felt beautiful. It felt true because it was beautiful. And that's one of the points that you have to take away. There were an awful lot of smart people who thought it was beautiful and felt that the doors of linguistics were opened and beckoning to them. As they say, I was one of them. So I understand that sentiment very, very well. But it's complicated. Clearly, this is complicated material. What does it tell us about? Well, it tells us about a lot of things at a lot of different levels. For one thing, it tells us a lot of very interesting things about the mentor-student relationship, which is a relationship that exists well beyond linguistics and even beyond science. It tells us about that, and it tells us a lot about rupture and continuity and revolutions. I don't think there's much reason to say that Chomsky's impact on linguistics has been anything short of revolutionary. At the same time, there's this tremendous core of continuity within this work in syntactic structures. So what we have to understand is that rupture and continuity fit together very tightly, very, very tightly, and that the mentor-student relationship is one that includes both rupture and continuity in its very essence. It's a lot like a nucleus where you've got a force that's holding particles together and other forces that are pulling them apart, and the two forces are acting against each other, and they're holding the two together until it explodes. And that's ultimately the story of Zellig Harris and Noam Chomsky.